Thank you. All right. All right, we're all ready? All right, the topic the Gemara has been dealing, hi Weissmans, recently has been the topic of Motzi Shem Ra. We've moved on in the last couple of days in the daf, but we've had it the last couple of days. We had a little bit about it at the end of the third parak. I mean, it's been a while. There's a lot, like in the last 2 weeks, I feel like half of Shas has slipped us by. But anyways, we'll try to at least talk about some things. And I wanted to pick this topic because it's an interesting topic in that there's a couple of facets to it that I wanted to discuss. Meaning there's the concept of Motzi Shem Ra within the context of the psukim relating to this, newlywed, right? This new couple. And unfortunately, the husband is not, too satisfied, we'll say, and he starts a whole claim. But it has its offshoots into the term that we use today of Motzi Shem Ra, right? And that's why I think it's very interesting in that there aren't a lot of topics that are it's like a topic within a topic, right? Where you have the general sense, and then there's a little nuance in it that applies to major halachic ramifications and things that are outside of its original context. Right? It's almost like that davar hayatza min haklal, right? Lo halaklal kula yatza, right? That whole business with detail in a halacha that goes out and teaches all kinds of, things by itself. That's why I think it's very interesting. And there's a lot of important, lessons we could learn from it. So the first thing you have to understand about Motzi Shem Ra is that the Torah spends many psukim talking about it. In fact, where it's found in Kitetse, the Torah hones in on the Nara. Okay, one thing that you'll know from doing daf for the last 2 weeks is that there are many particular halachos that apply to only this girl with a 6-month window. Meaning, there are special halachos that apply only if you're a Nara, not if you're a Ketana, not if you're a Bogeres. If you're between 12 and 12 and a half, then you enter into this complicated box where we have halachas that pertain only in this specific situation. It's a little bit like Yevamos, where we spent months discussing the different rules and regulations, but it only happens if you happen to be married and you happen to die and have a brother and have no children, and a lot of things have to happen in order to create this whole set of circumstances, right? It's like the pidyon haben. If you think about it, you have maybe like an 18% chance of making a pidyon haben, right? And there are so many halachas about it, but it's 5 or 6 things have to happen. That's why you have, 15-20% chance of actually having a pidyon haben. So we have all these halachos about the naira, but it's only for a 6-month period. And I've mentioned this many times in the shir before in different venues, and one of my personal favorite discussions to talk about is why the Torah spends so many psukim talking about one thing, and sometimes virtually a few letters or a few words talking about other things. All right, and this is one of the examples of this poor Nara Marasa, right? So the Torah, if you happen to have a chumash around, it's Dvarim 22:13. So the Torah starts off by saying Kikach ish isha uva alea usneya, right? And if you remember from, I don't know how many weeks ago was it, I'd say about 4 or 5 weeks ago, the Rambam, right, uses this very first pasuk in Motzi Shem Ra as the source for, remember? We had a whole class on it. Whether the institution of marriage is a mitzvah or not. Remember that whole discussion we had on Ksuvas Yud Aleph based on the bracha that we say under the chuppah, Asher Aser Lanu Sarusos, V'iter Lanu Sinesuos. Oraisa, because right, the Rosh says, well, to the Rabbanim, because it's a very funny bracha. It doesn't say Likadesh Isha or anything like that. So, anyways, so that was the Rambam who talked about this pasuk. So we're not going to go through all of it because we'll be here for a while. But what's interesting is that from 22:13, okay, to 22:21, which is 8 psukim, is about Motzi Shem Ra, okay, and then the Torah jumps from chapter 22, pasuk 23 to 29, another 6 psukim. So we have a total of 15 psukim talking about rules and regulations. A, in the first case of Motzi Shem Ra, and B, if a Nara Amurasa, who's a Besula, is promiscuous, she has a special type of death, which is called skila, okay, which Gemara has talked about a lot over the past week, which we should know already. So there's 15 or so psukim devoted to a certain girl under certain circumstances who has to be exactly between 12 and 12.5 years old. All right. So what I wanted to start off was, like I do frequently, is the most important thing in understanding this is that there are actually 2 mitzvos in the Torah to be Motzi Shem Ra on your wife. Right? So that's a very common question that's asked, and the answer is no, but we have mitzvahs like Yibum and Gerushin and all kinds of other mitzvahs that are not very, tasty, and we probably won't ever want to be this in the situation of being Motzi Shem Ra, but it's one of those, if it happens to happen, if you happen to want to divorce your wife, then there's a certain mitzvah in how to do it, right? Obviously, Yibum involves someone dying, so that's not very pleasant either. Nevertheless, it's a mitzvah. So it falls into the category of just things that happen beyond our control that we would rather, if we had our druthers, we would not want, but nevertheless, we have these mitzvos. So there's actually 2 mitzvos. And what I wanted to break down this particular shiur tonight is I wanted to discuss the Motzi Shem Ra aspect, the way it's dealt with in its context of husband and wife, and then I wanted to talk about the general Motzi Shem Ra, which we know today as tattletaling, okay, or as they say in Yiddish, yenting, okay. So that's what I wanted to talk about, and I want to end with a beautiful Orach Chaim that I've been saving for 4 years in my back pocket. I wanted to use it at a speech, but I was never asked to speak. And I said, okay, I'll save it. And anyways, it's a beautiful Orach Chaim, and I have to share it with you. But let's start off by talking about the chinuch in Mitzvah 553. Okay, Tov Kuf Nun Gimel 553. I'm just going to read it. Is Mitzvah Sheteshev Eshes Motzi Shem Ra Tachas LaOlam. Now, we don't even talk about. We already know what's involved in a Motzi Shem Ra. Okay, basically, the husband has a suspicion, or witnesses separately come, and the Gemara a couple of days ago discussed that at length. If it's both cases, if it's one case, does the husband have to know about it? Okay, various discussions about what the husband's role is. But the husband wakes up one day and says, I don't think you're a Besula, right? This presumably is right after the wedding night. And he becomes aware that he doesn't think she's a virgin, okay? And he goes to court and he proclaims, I got a raw deal, okay? I want my money back. She's not a virgin. And the Torah, in its first discussion of Noah Marasa, right, is, okay, well, let's deliberate. So they Judges go, they deliberate, and if he is found to be lying, they whip him. Okay. Second problem is he pays the fine of 100. And the cherry on top, the third thing is that he is stuck with her, assuming the wife is all for it, which sounds a little counterintuitive today, because what wife would want to stick with her husband who just slandered her in court, saying that she fooled around with someone else while we were engaged, right? That should be everyone's first question. And the answer to that is similar to a politically incorrect Ben Yehoyada I mentioned about 5 weeks ago, is unfortunately the way it used to be was that a woman desperately needed to be married. Because now, and we have to keep this in mind all the time when we're learning Seder Nashim, whether it's Yevamos, Ksuvos, Gittin, Kedushin, right? You always have to think about it, or else it doesn't make sense, right? So you'd have to just put yourself 1,500 years ago, right, where the woman's only chance of survival, okay, was to, right, be attached to a man who was the breadwinner. Okay, women were not the breadwinners, so she had to be married and get supported by her husband, which is the whole concept of the ksuva, which we spoke about at length about 6 weeks ago or so. So part of his punishment is that he is stuck with her, assuming she's okay with it. If he says, I don't want to, I want a divorce, he could never, ever leave her as long as he's living. Okay, he can't divorce her ever. That's his punishment. So that's pretty, which by the way, you remember in the third parak, when we talked about onus in the fata, right? It's called shota batzitzo, right? You break it, you buy it. Okay, that's the rule when it comes. You like that one, huh? That's the rule when it comes to rape. And the little known fact is it's the same rule when it comes to Motzi Shem Ra. So there's actually 2 mitzvahs in the Torah. One is that you're stuck with her, right? You have to stay married to her. And in mitzvah 554 is that you can't get divorced. So there's basically, it's a reiteration, but as we, in the world of mitzvahs, we call it an asay and a lav. The asay is that you're stuck with her, and the lav is that you can't get divorced. Even though it's, you know, intuitive that if you're stuck with her, you can't get divorced, but nevertheless, we have 2 mitzvahs. So 2 of the 613 mitzvahs deal with this specific circumstance where a husband wakes up one day and says she's not a basula and he's Motzi Shem Ra, and it has to fit the box. She has to be a certain age, and all of these things have to happen. Okay, so the Torah goes at length to discuss it. So I'm just going to read the Sefer HaChinuch so we get a broader idea. Shenitztava Motzi Shem Ra al ishto sheteshev tachtav la'olam va'afilu hi iveret omo kashchin. What if she is blind? What if she is gross and disgusting and overweight and filled with boils? Okay, you have to, it's called you're stuck with it. Shenemar v'lo tihiyeh le'isha. U'michlal din zeh shenitztavu. Again, I'm reading from the Sefer HaChinuch. Shenitztavu beis din gam ken lahalkoso. A, you're stuck with her. B, you get malchus. You get lashes from the court, which is not pleasant, right? Al asher hotzi Shem Ra b'sheker. Because you were Motzi Shem Ra and you lied, right? You slandered her, okay? And you got to pay her 100, right? Which goes to the father, but you got to pay her 100 sela. And the chinuch is cluing us into, I understand you got to pay a fine, but where in the Torah does it say that, right? Does it say that that you get a punishment for tattletaling? So there you have to go from Devarim to Vayikra, right? To Parshas Kedoshim, where it says Lo Selech Rachel, right? You can't be a tattletale. Okay, you can't go around and talk lashon hara about someone, whether it's true, whether it's false, especially whether it's false, obviously. So what's the essence of this commandment? I mean, it obviously sounds quite simple, right? If you were writing a book of law, right, you would want, this to be one of the things that, slander is a horrible thing. But it's very specific to this woman, liyaser hanivalim masot nivalot raot ka'ele, right? The root of this is to deter these manuvals, right? Manuval is a Yiddish term we use, but it comes from the Hebrew, right? Minuval, right? A disgusting person, a villain, evil person, right? A bad dude, we'll call him, right? It's to deter these people from engaging in these kind of acts, slander. Right, here you are, you have a brand new wife, right? You make up a lie, everyone knows about it, right? Even before Twitter, it was, they had, the town crier, right? Not the newspaper in Vermont, but the town crier who went around, and once it was public, everybody knew about it, right? So therefore, that is an example of rechilus, and therefore you are whipped. Okay, so that's just the beginning of the. That's the beginning of this of the Sefer HaMitzvos. Okay, now one thing that we just read over quickly is it's interesting. So who's the mitzvah on? Remember, this is not just a thing that we do; it's actually a mitzvah. So, like all mitzvos, is the mitzvah on. So the first line of it says Shenitztava Motzi Shem Ra alish, meaning this is a mitzvah on the man to what? To act in a certain way. If he does this, he has to go to court, he has to accept the penalty, and he's stuck with her. So the mitzvah is on the person, is on the husband. Okay, the Rambam, the Rambam has his own rendition of the 613 mitzvos. It's called Sefer HaMitzvos, and in his it says Shetzivanu din Motzi Shem Ra klomar Shetzivanu lahal koso. What's the mitzvah? The mitzvah isn't on the man to do, to get and accept his punishment. The mitzvah is on the court to give him malchus. So we see already a disagreement between the Chinuch and the Rambam as to who exactly the mitzvah is on. Now you're going to say, okay, that sounds very, trivial. It's not a big deal, but still, it's, it's just interesting how it, because it's a mitzvah, you have to know who it's on, right? Again, if it wasn't a mitzvah, then we don't really care as long as everything happens. But because it's specifically one of the big 613, you have to know who the mitzvah is on. Right? So therefore, the Rambam actually says it's on the court to carry out the punishment, as opposed to the man submitting to the court where the man is Mekayim the mitzvah. Okay, so I thought that was interesting to note. Okay, now part of the penalty, by the way, is paying 100. So it's interesting. There's a Ramban in Parshas Kitetza where this obviously is brought down. He says it's 100 is a nice round number, right? Like you would think, okay, well, base 10, right? 100, that's how much a fine is, right? But where they got the number 100 from? So the Ramban actually says that there's a reason, because the mohar of a woman is 50. Remember, we said that the dowry, that the ksuva is 200 zuz, but really it's 50 because the Torah is 4 times more, right? So it's really 50, right? It says chamishim kesef. So the Motzi Shem Ra is double. So is that just a coincidence that we just use nice round numbers to remember? It's like a parking ticket is $30, a bus stop is $40, and a no standing is $50, right? Actually, that was the prices 20 years ago. Everything has gone up. But anyways, we have different, we have different amounts based on the penalty. So the Ramban said it's no coincidence that 100 is double the 50 of the ksuva. Why? Because what was the intent of the man? The reason why the man made up all these lies about his wife was because he wanted to get rid of her. So therefore, the Torah implores what we call a knas on him, right? It's like a thief, right? We're going to get soon to Nezikin in about a year and a half. We're going to talk about the laws of a ganaf. A ganaf pays kefel, double. So the Ramban is equating the penalty of 100, likening it to a ganaf who has to pay double what he stole. Okay, but anyway, so that's a nice thing mentioned by the Ramban. Now, more on this concept of Motzi Shem Ra. So there's a very beautiful. I saw a Sharei Tshuva by the Rabbeinu Yonah. Okay, the Rabbeinu Yonah in Sharei Tshuva, which is, I guess, for lack of a better word, a Musar sefer that people read, right, mostly in their year in Israel, and they probably never see it again. But it's just, a nice sefer that discusses all kinds of, great things that we should, harness and Hilchas Tshuva, and one of the prakim and one of the subsections, he discusses all of the various, commandments that we have and the penalties. And he talks about Motzi Shem Ra, okay? And he says the following about a terrible thing. It says, Shenem Ravaya Musu Hanashim Motzei Dibas Hara'a B'Magefa Lifnei Hashem. Right? He's alluding obviously to the sin of the spies, right? Where the punishment is actually death for Motzi Shem Ra. Here, the husband gets malchus and he gets mammon, right? And he's stuck with her. But in fact, Motzi Shem Ra, right? The spies actually died for their sins, right? As we know from the story of the Meraglim in Parsha Shlach. Amar Rabbeinu Zichrono Levracha, Im Motzi Shem Ra al haaretz oncho b'misa, Motzi Shem Ra al ish Yisrael shenitzchai b'torah mitzvah chaskam v'kama. Now, what did the spies do Motzi Shem Ra on? On a country, right? Do you think the country was embarrassed? No, the country doesn't have feelings. The country is land, is trees and earth, right? So you could imagine if you actually insult someone and make up a story about someone and spread false rumors, right? You could imagine how much more so that's worse than what the Meraglim did, who only did it on a country. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, and then the Rabbeinu Yonah goes on to say, "V'nemar v'anshu oso mea kesef v'nasan la'avi hanara ki hotzi Hashem ra. Hine lo hiskira kasav cheto al asher haya mevakich nefesh ha'isha." You have to look at the psukim very carefully. It says, again, that's why I said, if you happen to have a chumash, so one of the psukim, I'll tell you exactly where to look. Again, it's chapter 22, and it is verse 19. It says, "V'anshu oso mea kesef," if he's found guilty, so we give him his fine of 100 kesef, and you give it to the father of the Nara. Why? The Torah actually uses the word ki. Like, of course we know why. After he did such a disgraceful act, the Torah goes on to say, I'm going to remind you why we're punishing him 100 shekel. Ki hotzi Shem Ra al besulas Yisrael. We're punishing him because he was being Motzi Shem Ra. Not that he wanted to kill her, God forbid. He only wanted to be Motzi Shem Ra. And that's what the Rabbeinu Yonah says so beautifully over here. He says, the Torah didn't say that he has to suffer now and pay his penalty and have a sin because he wanted, right, to kill her. in the court, right? Meaning he didn't end up doing it. He thought about it. I'm going to be Motzi Shem Ra. Hopefully they believe me. And in the end, she would be a zona. She would be, caught, right? And he says over here, and his point over here, I'm just going to read it in English. Behold, the verse did not mention his sin about having tried to take the life of a woman and causing her to be killed in court with false witnesses that he bought for her, for her fabricated harlotry. Yet it mentioned the iniquity of putting out a bad name. Meaning the Torah could have said, you know why he's got to pay this hefty fine? Because he tried to kill this person. No, the Torah didn't say that the fine is because he tried to kill her. That would make sense if I were writing the Torah. That's a great reason to get such a heavy fine. No, because he wanted to what? He wanted to give her a bad name. And he says from there, it's better, right? For it is a greater iniquity than one seeking to squelch a life, as the pain of the shame is more bitter than death. It sounds better in Hebrew. I'll read it in Hebrew, right? The Hiskir Avan Hotzah Shem Ra, the reason why the Torah says we fine him and punish him because he was Motzi Shem Ra, not because he tried to kill her, Kihu Avon Hagadol Yoter Min HaMavakesh Nefesh L'Safota. Because that's exactly what the point is. That's the punchline, is because what he tried to do, and they say this some ways, it's one thing killing someone, but if you kill their reputation, right? If you kill someone, they're gone forever. If you kill their reputation, right? Like that commercial for Reputation Defender, right? That you hear on TV, right? If you kill someone's reputation, there's no way out. There is no way they could ever recover, or it's very, very difficult to mud. Okay, and that's what it is. Kitzar haklima mar mimaves. When you're disgraced and embarrassed, it's worse than death, says the Rabbeinu Yonah. Right? Wow, this is really good stuff here. I recommend it. Okay, anyway, so I just thought that's a very worthwhile Rabbeinu Yonah, and it's funny because he actually is referring to a Mishnah in Erechim. Believe it or not, in Shas, if you've done Shas, you would know that the sugya of Lashon Hara, believe it or not, appears hidden in some obscure Masechta called Erechim. And the reason why it's in Erechim is because the Mishnah talks about the following. The Mishnah gives a case, B'motzi Shem Ra lahakil ulahachmir, right? When it comes to being Motzi Shem Ra, okay, there are times that it works in your favor, and there are times when it doesn't work in your favor. What does that mean? Because it's a fine, right? Very good. It's actually Tesvav. It's actually 15 and 16, so you're off by one. Okay, we'll get to that, Yosef. We have a whole share on that question. But anyways, so the Mishnah in Erechim says, Echad shehotzi Shem Ra al hagdola shebekahuna v'al haktana shebiyisrael. We've had this, if you remember in Bava Kama, when it comes to certain fines you have to pay. So a fine by definition means you have to pay a certain amount, whether it equals the amount of damage you did, or whether it didn't even come close to equaling the amount of damage you did, right? Like we have a kanas, like a 30, right? You pay 50 if you rape, right? Now, you would think it makes a difference if you rape a homeless woman or if you rape the president's daughter, right? There's a pretty big difference between the two. But believe it or not, the Torah does not distinguish between the two. That's the definition of the word fine, right? You park by a hydrant, it doesn't matter if you park for 5 minutes, right? When you go into the bodega to get a drink and you come out and the guy's writing a ticket, or it doesn't matter if you parked there for 23 hours, right? It's a certain amount, right? You might as well stay the whole day. That's what people do when they get tickets, right? So it's the definition of a fine is something that it doesn't matter, the circumstances really don't matter. If you do it, then you're chayiv a certain amount. And that's exactly what the Mishnah in Erechim says. Whether you are Motzi Shem Ra on the daughter of the Kohen Gadol, or a regular so what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says, believe it or not, that when you utter something and make up a story and concoct a story on your bride, you pay 100, right? What if you rape someone? You pay 50. So the Mishnah is saying, wow, that's a real head scratcher. You're telling me, it's like the Ramban says, right? You pay double, right? You're telling me that you rape her, you pay 50, and if you're Motzi Shem Ra on her, you pay 100? That's not logical. That's exactly the point, right? Speech, and this is what we said a minute ago from the Rabbeinu Yonah, speech is worse than actions, all right? And I don't have to tell you to just turn on the TV, and that's all you need to know, right? The way people speak, what people say, what people don't say, how people put each other down, right? Forget about it. We're not going to talk about it. But you could understand how 1,500 years ago in the Mishnah, they realized this, right? The speech brought down the Beis HaMikdash. We have the story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa, all kinds of terrible things in Jewish history. This is all in this one line in the Mishnah in Erechim. And the punchline, the way the Mishnah ends off by saying, Sheken Matzina Shel Nechtam Gzar Din Al Avosenu B'Midbar, right? When it came to the straw that broke the camel's back, right? We sinned with the Egel. We sinned over here. Right? Every parsha we're sinning. But you know what the straw that broke the camel's back was? Lashon Hara. It says Vayinasu Asize Eser Pamim B'Lo Shema B'Koli. Okay, that's how the Mishnah ends off. So just on this specific topic of Motzi Shem Ra, now what do we do today? If you have a case today, so how much of this applies? So the chinuch, if you look back at the chinuch actually says that today, George, you have a question? Yes, no, maybe. George, you have a question? Did you freeze? Okay, we could talk about it later. Interesting. So the Minchas Chinuch, I'm sorry, the Sefer Chinuch says that if this happens today, obviously you don't do, right? You don't have Malkus today and you don't have Mammon, but he says, Halacha L'maisa, 21st century, you're stuck with your wife. So he splits the baby because, again, there's three things. There's the money, there's the lashes, and then there's you got to stick with her, right? So two of the three don't apply for a technical reason because we have no Beis HaMikdash, we don't whip people, and a knas is not levied today because we don't have the Sanhedrin. But the third thing of staying with her, the Minchas Chinuch actually says that applies today. Okay, the Rambam says it doesn't apply today because the Rambam lumps it together with the other two items. So I just wanted to throw that in. Now, all of this comes from, meaning all of this is the subtopic of dealing with the man, right, the husband and the wife and the Motzi Shem Ra. So for the second half, I wanted to discuss the Gemara. Believe it or not, this is a Gemara shir, so we got to do the Gemara at some point. The Gemara here is on page Mem Hey, okay, 45b. Okay, it's 2, 4, 6, 8. It's about, I don't know, 15, 16 lines from the bottom on 45b. Right in the middle, it says Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan. Hamotzi Shem Ra. Okay, loke v'nosen meyasela. Okay, if you are Motzi Shem Ra, so as we've been discussing up to now, you have the penalty of Malkus and 100. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Lilkos. When it comes to Malkos, we always give him Malkus. When it comes to the fine of 100, so Baal Nosen, Lo Baal Eno Nosen. Rabbi Yehuda actually distinguishes whether he actually consummated the marriage or not. So that's something that we didn't really talk about. Okay, that's a fine detail, meaning you would think to yourself, okay, he probably wants to be Motzi Shem Ra because he actually, had it with his wife. So he actually saw it, he experienced it, and for whatever reason, his conclusion was that she's not a virgin. So he could only know that if he did the act. So that's why, in the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, he says that if he did not have bia, then he's not chayiv to pay the 100 shekel fine. Okay, so the Gemara says, so the Gemara says this is actually a machlokes in a different scenario between Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov and the Rabbanan. That's the opinion of the Rabbanan, that it doesn't really matter whether he consummated the marriage or not. He has to pay the fine. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Lilkos Loka Mikol Makom. It doesn't matter when in the right. Rabbi Yehuda says that he always gets malchus, but Mea Sela, when it comes to the money payment, Baal, that's only if he consummates the marriage. But then he's nosen. Lo Baal, Eno nosen, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. He's of the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, who we're going to see, or we saw 2 days ago, but back in the past when we had this daf a couple days ago. Who said that the parsha of Motzi Shem Ra is only when he consummated the marriage. Okay, so therefore, right, the 100 we don't have to impose on the Baal only if he consummated. Now, why do we split the baby? Why are we making a difference between the punishment of the money, of the fine, and the lashes? Why do we give him malchus? You know why he gave him malchus? So Rashi explains, and we're going to see it on 46, is because when he's chayav malchus because of the pasuk of lo selech Rachel. He acted in a universal, right? Meaning he did a universal sin, not specifically to this woman, is he defamed someone. Now that someone happens to be his, newly wedded wife, which is horrible, but nevertheless, she is still another person in the world who he would get punished for if he defames her. So that's exactly why he gets malchus. Even if he didn't consummate, it doesn't matter. You don't have to consummate the marriage with her to be chayav malchus. Money is a separate story, but malchus, it doesn't really matter if he consummated the marriage or not. Rashi, by the way, talks about the concept, which we're not going to get into, we'll maybe save it for some time else, is that this is actually a lav she'ein bo maisa, meaning when we talk about malchus, you have to do something. The prototype that the Torah uses is muzzling your animal while it's eating. That's a very bad thing. It's not just PETA has a problem with it. The Torah has a problem with it because animals should be treated with, kindly. And when they're eating, you have to give them a chance to eat, right? So therefore, if you did an action, right, the Gemara learned because of in Maseches Malchus, because the psukim are right next to each other, Lo Sachsam Shor B'Disho, and the whole discussion about Malchus in Parshas Shoft, in Parshas Kitetse, is that you have to actually do an action. So the question is, did he do an action? Well, you could say he did an action because we already know from the Mishnah in Erechin that speaking bad about someone is twice as worse as raping someone. So that's proof, but that's more on an agadic level. On a halachic level, the Gemara goes back and forth whether dibur, whether speaking is considered an action or not. Me taking a muzzle from my house and putting it on an animal is a real bona fide, what they call in yeshiva, a maisa, right? A richtige maisa, a real maisa. Again, we could spend hours on this. Believe me, I did once. And we'll leave that for a different time. But anyways, so we see that we're going to be introduced now. And if you look on page Mem Vav, the next page, 46a, the Gemara actually brings it like, I don't know, 12 or 13 lines from the top, right in the middle, right at the end of the line. It says, Azharu l'motzi Shem Ra min alon. How do we know that there's, again, because the law is that you can't get malchus unless you're warned. So the Gemara all the time says, well, I understand it has the punishment, but you have to have a warning, right? We're a very civil nation. We only punish if we warn. So the Gemara always has to find the actual, what we call the azhara, the warning. So we warn from the pasuk of, which has nothing to do with dvarim. This is a general prohibition about acting civilly in the world, about slandering people, is the pasuk in Kedoshim of Lo Seilech Rachel. Okay, so now because the Gemara brought up this pasuk of Lo Seilech Rachel, I want to spend the remaining time talking about this, right? Talking about this pasuk. What does it mean? First of all, it's a very funny pasuk, because what does it say? Well, first of all, we have to know Parshas Kedoshim. Okay, Parshas Kedoshim, right in the beginning, says the following pasuk. It says, "Lo seilech Rachel ba'amecha v'lo samu al dam re'echa ani Hashem." Okay, two things that much ink was spilled. Talks about being a tattletale. The second half of the pasuk talks about not standing by while your friend is dying. Okay, now there's a whole discussion what the connection is. We'll see maybe that it's very related, knowing, of course, the Mishnah in Erechin and about how terrible it is to be Motzi Shem Ra, and it's like what and what you can cause, right? You know, from the Rabbeinu Yonah that we saw about the Meraglim and how everything is really connected. Anyways, so, but if you look at, forget about the second half of the pasuk, because that's a shir by itself. Let's just look at the first four words. Lo telech rachel ba'amecha. It doesn't say don't be a tattletale. It says don't walk, right? The word telech literally means to go. It says don't go as a rachel in your nation. So whenever we're learning Chumash, right, we always go to our big guns, right? Whenever we have, in this year at least, I like to start with the ABCs. And the A of the ABC is usually Rashi. So what does Rashi say? Rashi says, Ani Omer al Shem Shekol Mishalche Midanim Umisapri Lashon Hara Hochem Bebate Re'ehem L'Ragel Ma Yiru Ra. Okay? All of those people who, they translate, sow discord between people, okay? People who are up to no good, okay? And they tattletale and they gossip, umisapri lashon hara, holchem bevate re'ehem, right? They go to their friend's house, right? They hear people talking and they go slander, l'ragel ma yiru ra. They go to their friend's house specifically in order l'ragel. Interesting word. L'ragel, we know the word miraglim. Right? Sounds like what we said before. The miraglim are somehow connected to this. And Rashi's going to say that in Hebrew, actually I'll say that because this is a very interesting Rashi. I think everyone should know this Rashi. But Rashi says over here, at least in the beginning, he says that they go to their friend's house to spy what evil they can do there, or what can they pick up and go, right? It's like a disease. What can I pick up in this house and go to a different house and infect that house with, right? So that's exactly what Lashon Hara is. Let me go here, hear something, and then I'll tattletale and I'll say it to someone else. Okay? Nikru holche rachil, holche regila. And he quotes a French word, okay, which has the word, and in French, it's right, the word spy is in the word espiment. So that's Rashi's Old French. And then he says, and my proof that there's some kind of like activity here. Again, it's not just me and you sitting at a bar and talking and yenting and right. And it's someone actually proactively goes from place to place, picks up information. I hope no one here can relate to this, and goes and tells the next person, and then goes and tells the next person, and like infects a whole group of people with information that is probably not helpful, right? That is slander, right? Slanderous and Lashon Hara and all kinds of things. And Rashi proves it, Shalom Matzinu Rechila She'ein, because it uses the word halicha, right? Lo selech Rachel, and he quotes a pasuk in Yirmiyahu, Holchei Rachel, Ushar Lashon Hara Ein Kasav Bo Halicha. When it comes to Lashon Hara, it doesn't say the word halicha. For some reason, Rashi says when it comes to Rechilus, then it says the verb of actually moving and going. Okay? Now here's Rashi says something very interesting. So the word is, and this is, if you're into Hebrew language, which I am, you would know that the word liragel, reish gimel lamed, you can take the gimel out and substitute it with a chaf. Why is that? And Rashi says, I have a better one. Shekol ha'osios shemotzaeha mimakom echad mischalfa zu bazu. When you pronounce, again, this is a shir by itself, but again, so one of the things you'll know if you're an aficionado in Hebrew is that letters can be interchanged like a gimel and a chaf because they come from the same place in the mouth. For example, bays and a pay, a bet and a pa, a b and a p come from the same, right? When you start to talk, it comes from the same place in your mouth. And a gimel and a chaf are related, right? And a zayin and a tzadi, for example, right? A z, right, and a tza and a za are very similar, right? Whatever, and it goes through other examples. Anyways, so that's what Rashi says. So Rashi basically says, you know what you are? What we would call today a yenta. That's what it is. You know, it's funny. So I was looking. You know, everyone knows that yenta is a Yiddish word, but where did the name actually come from, right? So I was looking, it's very interesting. So yenta, the term that we all love to use today, unfortunately, if you know someone named Yentl, that's where the word actually came from. But what does Yentl have to do with a yenta? Not all Yentls are yentas. It's just bad luck that you're unfortunately named Yentl. But why are yentals yentas? So I saw, and I heard this a long time ago, but I was refreshed because the word Gentile, okay, which we, right, all those who follow Jackie Mason of blessed memory know that was one of his, most favorite words. So Yentl, the Yiddish name that we named sometime, well, not now, maybe 50 years ago, right? If you were named someone Yentl, the name Yentl comes from the Italian word Gentile, okay? And it's funny because Gentile, the etymology of it is someone who's gentle or genteel. Like in English, we use the word genteel, okay, or gentle. That is the same word as a Gentile, right? Meaning, right, non-Jewish, right? But the problem is someone who's genteel, he's not a yenta though. So that's where the confusion is, because it's like an oxymoron, right? Someone who's genteel is like refined and noble. And so how in the world did that, right? It's like a whole miss up. So anyways, but the point is that over time, Yentl became Yenta, okay? So the actual answer to that question is that how the word genteel, which means, fine and sound like oxymorons. So it's actually from the Foverts, in the 1920s, the Yiddish newspaper. So there was some comics by this guy named his last name was Kovner, right? And it was about a Yenta whose name was, a gossip monger whose name was Yenta. Her name was Yenta Telabunda. I don't know if anyone knows, this from the forward in the 1920s, might be a little bit obscure, but anyways, so there's a very popular sketch and it became synonymous with a busybody, someone who's always knowing information and who's this and who's that, right? Everyone has their yentas that they go to for information, and that continued today. And then, of course, we had Fiddler on the Roof, which popularized it, and then we had Yentl, and the rest is history. But it's just interesting how it comes from Yenta, which is Gentile, which someone who's very refined. So it's just very interesting etymology. And like I said, this is all Torah. So anyways, I just thought that would be interesting. So let's look at, we have the Rashi, right, who basically says that this Rachel is a big fat Yenta, okay, who goes around from place to place, picking up tidbits of information and passing it on, right, and infecting other houses. There's a Kli Yakar in Shlach, which is related to this, that I saw that was very interesting. The Kli Yakar says that when it comes to there's three words to describe what the Meraglim did. It says Vayaturu, Vayachperu, and Vayaraglu. Right? We know that, not Yiddish, my mind's on Yiddish, that Hebrew is a very rich language, okay, and we have a lot of synonyms. So he explains that Vayaturu, Vayachperu, and Vayaraglu are three different ways and attitudes that the Meraglim went out to seek the country, and that the worst one is Vayaraglu, right? Because they knew from the beginning that they didn't want to go. All they did was complain how great it was in Mitzrayim, and every single time that came up, they just said it's better that we were in Mitzrayim, better in Mitzrayim, better in Mitzrayim, and they convinced themselves that. And they ended up lying, and just an interesting Kli Yakar if you want to look that up. The different, and again, it all comes back to, of course, Vayiragel and Rachel. So that's exactly what they did. The other source, of course, when you talk about the big guns, you have Rashi, you have the Ibn Ezer. What does the Ibn Ezer say? He says the word Rachel, or a tattletale, is similar to the word Rechulascha, which is the pasuk in Yecheskel for merchandise. And the word Rochel, a Rochel is a merchant, right? He says, V'hatam hamalshin ki arochel matik yikna mizeh v'yimkar lezeh. What does a merchant do, right? He buys low and he sells high, meaning he goes from place to place and he sells, and he buys and he sells, and he goes. And in fact, the Gemara talks about a ruchla, right? Sometimes he compares it to a Tana who doesn't talk about all the examples in a Mishnah. So the Gemara uses an example of a ruchla also. But it's someone who goes around and and peddles, but here he's peddling bad stuff. So he says a ruchel is a slanderer, right? For the merchant moves goods. He buys from one person and sells to another. So too, the tattletale reveals to one person what he heard from another person, right? Even if it's not so bad. Again, and that's the whole nuance of this, is that it's like Lashon Hara. Like we always think it's, it's bad stuff, but we're going to see in a second that even if it's neutral, the fact that you're spreading things which you have no advantage just for gossip's sake is a very, very, very bad thing. Okay. Okay, so that's the Ibn Ezer. Oh yes, the Targum Yonasan Ben Uziel. Lo tiavon aslan basar lishon tlisa. He says, "Thou shalt not go after the slanderous tongue, which is cruel as a sword that killeth with its two edges, in uttering false accusations to afflict thy people." So that's a very obviously he's in Aramaic, but I said it in Hebrew, but it's very profound, as you could see. So we're getting the idea. Again, we took it from the context of Motzi Shem Ra in the Gemara and Ksuvas, but because we want to know why you get Malkus, so now we understand how slanderous and disastrous this situation is, with this poor, with this poor bride, what she has to deal with. So let's look. We don't have a lot of time left, but there's so much more I have here. The Sefer HaChinuch, okay, has this down, right? It's a pasuk in Kedoshim, as we saw, mitzvah number 236, Shelo l'ragel. Interesting. Not lo l'rachel, shelo l'ragel. What does that mean? Not to spy. Right? Again, it's like Rashi. He's equating rechilus with ragel, to spy. Again, right? So he says, "Shenimnu rechilus." Right? We have that it's a mitzvah that we should prevent ourselves from tattletaling. Shenemer lo sachel rachel lo seilach rachel v'inyanhu she'im nishma adam midav. I'm just going to read it in English because we have, as usual, no time left. And the matter is that if a person hears something bad about his fellow, that he should not go to him and tell him X is saying so and so, unless his intention is to remove damages or to stop a quarrel. 5% of the time, right? Overwhelming minority of the time is where you actually have a good reason to, right? Meaning, if you want to stop a fight and you know information about someone else, so then you could use it to make peace. But other than that, it's bad. Okay? And our sages say the meaning of the rachel, rach lazeh, the kasha lazeh, right? Meaning, and the Gemara actually says that in Ksuvas, we didn't end up finishing Daf Mem Vav, but the word rachil also comes from the word some soft, means you're soft to this one and hard to that one. Okay? So what's the reason that you shouldn't do this? So the Minchas, so the Sefer Chinuch goes into his shorish of the mitzvah. Again, it sounds like this sounds like a no-brainer. Ki Hashem chafetz b'tovas habrios, right? God desires the good of the creatures that he created. Right? Because what do you think happens when people go around and spread gossip? Nothing good comes out of it. We didn't even talk about it, but one of the things about how we deal with this today, there are many tshuvas on how we, obviously social media and postings. What if I write it in a newspaper? Is that the same thing as saying it? What if I write an article slandering the rabbi in Washington, right? Or I make up something. Now, I didn't say anything, I wrote it. So you're going to say, well, it's even worse, right? Because you write it on a paper that 1 million people read. Or what if I post it on Instagram? Or what if I text it? All right, you could see how these things today, which obviously most of the problems are caused, right, by social media and the like, not for now. But, so you could see that a rabbi will have his hands full with these kinds of questions about, libel and writing nasty stuff. But what if it's true? Because that's what everyone's first question is. But it's true. The rabbi did do X, Y, and Z. So why can't we write about it? So there's a plethora of discussion. And as usual, much ink was spilled or is currently spilled on this topic. We're running out of time. I have so much of other things to say. But we didn't even get to the Orach Chaim. But okay, let's just do a little bit more. because I want to just look at the Rambam. The Rambam has a whole has a whole chapter in Hilchas Deos. The very last chapter of Hilchas Deos, chapter 7. He says, "Hamaraga b'chavera over belotase shenemar lo telech rachel ba'amecha." Right? He says, "V'afal pi she'ein lokin." Considered a Maisa. Remember, as we spoke about before, he says, "Avon gadolhu v'gorom laharg nefashos rabos miYisrael." People die for this. Okay, it could cause a chain reaction. And the Rambam goes on to say, it's someone who, like we said before. He says, by the way, the English word is actually a sycophant. If you've heard that word, so that's a word that's interchanged with a rachil, just for all those, one who loads himself up with matters and goes from this one to that one, saying to each, such did that man, such have I said that I heard concerning that man, even though it to be true. Remember we said that? Even if it's true, 100% true, nevertheless, the Rambam says he destroys the universe. All right? I hope TMZ isn't listening in today. Right? That's what the whole channel's about. Right? It's Rechilas, right, from A to Z. What we were just talking about, Instagram and everything. Now, if you look at and the Rambam talks about the gravity of the sin. He says, right? He says there are the big three, avodah zarah, gilui arayos, shvichas damim, and then he adds on, says the Rambam, I'm not making this up, the Rambam says, v'lashon hara keneged kulam. And lashon hara is tantamount to all of those three big sins that every single Jew knows are the cardinal three sins. Says the Rambam, lashon hara is up there on that Mount Rushmore. Okay, really, really tough stuff. I don't even know if I want to talk more about it. Now, how do I know we all do it? Because there's a famous Gemara in Bava Basra that says, it talks about sins that the Jewish people do. It says, right? It says, Rov begezel umiyat ba'arayitz v'hakol b'lashon hara. It says a majority of the Jewish people now and then steal a little bit. The minority of the Jewish people, right, are involved in promiscuity and gilui arayos, but 100% of the Jewish people are involved in lashon hara. That's what the Gemara in Bava Basra says. So it just goes to show you how horrible it is, and we all do it on some level, but I guess if we curb a little bit, I never proselytize, but it's one of those things that the more and more you read about it, the more and more you don't want to read about it. So, I'm just going to end off the way the Sefer HaChinuch ends off. He says, and the Chinuch doesn't talk this way about most things. He says, that it's a horrible thing, again, like we spoke about. He says there's no malchus, as we spoke about, because it's a lav she'ein bo maisa. Here it is. Here's the punchline. You ready? V'kama shuluchim lamakom lahalkos milvad ritzua shel egel v'shel paros. He says, technically, the court is not lashes, but God, I'm going to read it in English, because he says, but nonetheless, there are several agents to the omnipresent, capital O, to give lashes besides a whip of a calf skin or a cow skin. He says God has other ways of getting us for this. He says, forget about malchus. He says this could even lead to chiyuv misa. And then he gets onto the whole discussion. I'm sorry, we're running late, but there's so much to talk about. He connects this to a din of a moser, right? A maser, someone who gives someone up, right? The government says, show me that guy's field. He didn't pay his taxes, and he shows someone else's field, right? Again, these are horrible things that they all stem from this horrible trait of tattletaling, and it leads to death, because the punishment that we give a maser in Judaism, which is one of the worst things you could be, right? Worse than avodah zarah, right? The Gemara in Bava Kama goes on and talks about how disgusting and reviling this concept of being a maser, right? Of being right of what's the word I'm looking for? A maser. That's what they call him, right? Is one of the worst things you could do, and he's actually a and there's other bunch of things, but I am sorry we didn't get to do the Orach Chaim. I'll save it for, I don't know, next cycle. But it's a great Orach Chaim on the whole Motzi Shem Ra, the way he learns the Parsha. But anyways, that's that. Sorry.